I always believed my life was perfectly aligned, much like the crisp rows of skyscrapers dotting the Manhattan skyline. I had a loving husband, Jason, and a stable career at one of the top investment firms in the city. We had been married for nearly a decade, and though the fiery passion of our early years had settled into something calmer, I never doubted our commitment. But life has a way of shifting when you least expect it, like an earthquake trembling beneath a seemingly solid foundation. That shift came on an unremarkable Tuesday evening when I stayed late at work. Before we dive into this shocking story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale of love, betrayal, and consequences. Now, let's begin. The rain drummed steadily against the glass panes of my office window, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound that merged with the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The office, usually buzzing with life, had been reduced to a hollow, sterile space. Desks sat abandoned, the occasional blinking cursor of an idle computer screen the only movement in sight. Most of my colleagues had left hours ago, their conversations and laughter fading into the backdrop of the city's nightscape. I had stayed behind to finalize a client presentation due first thing in the morning. The task had consumed me, allowing me to briefly forget the growing restlessness that had been gnawing at the edges of my otherwise predictable life. I stretched my arms, fatigue settling into my bones, and grabbed the neatly stacked reports from my desk. As I moved toward my supervisor's office to drop them off, I noticed the faintest sliver of warm light spilling from the partially open door. It was unusual. Nearly everyone had gone home. A part of me hesitated. The professional thing to do was to leave the files on his desk and go. But something, curiosity, perhaps, compelled me forward. Sebastian. Even his name carried weight. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without ever having to raise his voice. Tall, broad-shouldered, always immaculately dressed in fitted suits that hinted at a physique forged through discipline. There was an effortless control in the way he moved, in the way people leaned in when he spoke, as if whatever he had to say was of utmost importance. He was my boss, a figure of authority, a professional acquaintance. And yet, there was something about him that unsettled me in ways I struggled to understand. I raised my hand to knock, but stopped short when no response came. Perhaps he had stepped out. But then, why was his door ajar? Cautiously, I pushed it open a fraction more, just enough to see inside. My breath hitched. He stood with his back to me, bare from the waist up. A towel slung low around his hips, damp tendrils of dark hair curling at his nape. The warm glow from his desk lamp illuminated the sharp angles of his shoulder blades, the defined ridges of his back, glistening slightly from the residual moisture clinging to his skin. He exuded an effortless magnetism, a raw, unfiltered masculinity that sent my senses into overdrive. A war raged inside me in the span of a single heartbeat. I should leave. I should turn around and pretend I had never seen this. Yet, my feet remained rooted to the ground. Something primal, something reckless held me there, eyes betraying my better judgment. Then, as if sensing my presence, he turned just enough for our eyes to meet. The moment stretched, thick with something unspoken. His expression was unreadable at first, but then, a slow, knowing smirk touched the corner of his lips. The kind of smirk that suggested he was well aware of the effect he had on people. On me. Heat surged to my face, mortified at my own inability to look away. I forced myself to clear my throat, to break whatever invisible tether had latched onto me. The sound of my voice came out uneven, barely above a whisper. I muttered an apology, stumbled back a step, but my hands trembled, betraying the turmoil that had been set in motion. He reached for a crisp, white dress shirt, pulling it over his shoulders in one fluid motion. The fabric clung to him, damp and unyielding, molding to every muscle. I should have left the second I could, but I lingered a second too long, unwilling or unable to stop my gaze from traveling the length of him. He knew, and that knowledge shifted something between us, subtle but irrevocable. I turned on my heel, practically fleeing down the hallway, my heels clicking against the polished floors in hurried succession. My heartbeat roared in my ears, a frantic, chaotic rhythm that refused to settle even as I reached my desk. This was nothing, I told myself. A moment of accidental voyeurism. An awkward encounter that would fade into the recesses of my mind by morning. But even as I repeated those words, the image of Sebastian, his smirk, his gaze, the way his presence had unraveled something deep within me, lingered far longer than it should have. That night, as I lay beside Jason, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breath, I tried to push the memory away, but it clung to me like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift within me. Something dangerous. Something I wasn't sure I could control. In the days that followed, I convinced myself that it had been nothing, a fleeting, inconsequential moment that would fade into obscurity. But the human mind has a way of fixating on what it shouldn't. My thoughts betrayed me, revisiting the stolen glances, the heat that lingered in the air between us, the unspoken words that settled beneath my skin. It wasn't just in my head. Sebastian had changed, or maybe I had. Either way, I couldn't ignore the way his presence seemed to stretch, filling every unoccupied space around me. It was the way he lingered near my desk in meetings, the subtle, deliberate way he held my gaze just a beat longer than necessary. It was the way his voice seemed to drop an octave lower when he spoke to me, like a secret only I was meant to hear. I told myself it was harmless. A game of sorts. An attraction that would fizzle out as quickly as it had sparked. But deep down, I knew better. Then, one afternoon, the shift became undeniable. I had been reviewing a client proposal at my desk when his voice cut through the quiet hum of the office. "Emma, do you have a moment?" I looked up to find him standing at the edge of my cubicle, his expression unreadable but his posture relaxed, expectant. My fingers tightened around my pen. "Of course," I replied, trying to steady my voice as I rose from my chair. His office felt different this time. The air heavier, charged with something unsaid. He gestured for me to sit, but instead of retreating behind his desk like he usually did, he remained standing. Leaning against the edge, the proximity between us smaller than before. "I wanted to go over the client pitch," he said, but there was something in his tone, something deliberate. I nodded, keeping my focus on the folder he handed me, but when I reached for it, the tips of his fingers brushed against mine. It was brief, so fleeting it could have been accidental, but my pulse betrayed me, hammering against my ribs. The corners of his lips twitched, barely perceptible, as if he had noticed. The meeting should have lasted 5 minutes. It stretched into 20. The details of the pitch blurred in my mind, drowned out by the undercurrent of tension tightening the space between us. When I finally left his office, I felt the weight of something shift. Like a door had been cracked open, letting in a rush of something forbidden. In the days that followed, it became a pattern. A passing touch that lingered half a second too long. The way his fingers grazed my lower back as he walked past. The way his voice dipped when he said my name, sending a ripple of something unshakable down my spine. The office, once neutral and mundane, had become a stage for something unspoken. Every glance, every stolen moment, built upon the last, stacking like a house of cards. The air between us grew thicker, anticipation humming beneath the surface. And still, I told myself it was nothing. That nothing had happened. Until it did. It was late, long after the office had emptied. The overhead lights casting a dim glow against the silence. I had been lost in my work when I felt him before I saw him. The presence of him, standing in my peripheral vision. His warmth lingering before his voice even broke the quiet. "You should go home." I glanced up, my breath catching when I saw him leaning against the doorway, watching me with an intensity that sent a tremor through my stomach. "I just need to finish this," I murmured, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I meant the report or the inevitable path I was walking toward. Sebastian stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. He placed a hand on the desk, his fingers inches from mine. The air shifted, charged with something unspoken, something waiting. I should have moved. I should have laughed it off, gathered my things, and left. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. my pulse hammering against my skin as I felt the invisible line between us blur. As I realized, with startling clarity, that there was no turning back. The office was nearly silent. The usual bustle of the workday replaced by the distant hum of the city below. The air conditioning murmured softly, punctuated only by the occasional creak of an aging chair or the tap of my fingers against the keyboard. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, a reminder that the building, too, was growing weary from the long hours. The weight of exhaustion settled into my bones, but I pushed forward, determined to finish the report before the weekend. Then, a familiar presence. A cup of coffee materialized beside me, steam curling toward the dimly lit ceiling. I knew before looking that it was him. The scent of fresh espresso mingled with the faintest trace of his cologne, something warm, something dark, something that had become impossible to ignore. I turned slightly, finding Sebastian leaning against my desk, his gaze unreadable but unwavering. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, something patient yet deliberate. The dim lighting softened his features, casting shadows along the sharp angles of his jawline, the curve of his mouth. He had loosened his tie, the top button of his shirt undone, an air of effortless ease surrounding him. But beneath it, I could sense the restraint, the carefully measured control he so often held over himself. A flicker of something electric passed between us, charged and waiting. "You've been working too hard." The words settled over me, a gentle nudge, an excuse for concern that barely masked something else beneath the surface. I let out a soft laugh, an attempt to defuse whatever this was turning into. "It's part of the job." But even as I spoke, I felt the moment tilting, slipping into something neither of us could pull back from. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me, as if memorizing every small detail, the way my fingers gripped the edge of the desk, the way my breath had grown just slightly uneven. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more measured, more certain. "You deserve more than this." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, the unspoken weight behind them. The way his fingers, barely grazing mine as he reached for my pen, lingered just a second too long. The way the air in the room shifted, thickening with something unnameable, undeniable. I should have pulled away. I should have put distance between us, laughed it off, made some excuse about the late hour. But I didn't move. Instead, I felt my body betray me, drawn toward him in a way that was both reckless and inevitable. My pulse quickened, heat creeping along my skin as his presence loomed closer, the inches between us evaporating. There was no moment of decision, no rational thought left to halt the trajectory we had set in motion weeks before. There was only sensation, the way my breath caught in my throat, the way his fingertips brushed against my wrist, sending a shiver through me. And then, finally, the moment cracked. I leaned in. Or maybe he did. Maybe we met in the middle. Neither one fully willing to take responsibility for what had already become inevitable. The first brush of lips was tentative, uncertain. A question neither of us dared ask aloud. But the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before the dam broke, before the tension that had been coiling between us snapped into something desperate, something consuming. His hand found the curve of my waist, fingers pressing just firmly enough to pull me closer. My own hands, traitorous in their need, found his shoulders, anchoring myself against the unraveling. His lips were warm, his breath fanning against my skin as the kiss deepened, turned feverish, turned into something neither of us could deny anymore. A deep, throaty exhale escaped him as his fingers skimmed along my spine, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. The air felt charged, the quiet hum of the city outside drowned out by the thundering pulse in my ears. His hands roamed, tracing, exploring, committing every inch of me to memory. We stumbled back against the desk, the edge pressing into me, grounding me to reality, even as everything else spiraled out of control. His hands gripped the surface behind me, caging me in. But it didn't feel confining, it felt exhilarating, as though the world had shrunk to just this moment, just us. My fingers wove into his hair, tugging slightly, earning a sharp inhale from him before he deepened the kiss further, his control slipping, unraveling. His mouth trailed down the column of my neck, the heat of his breath searing against my skin, making me arch involuntarily beneath his touch. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to stop, to think, to remember the consequences waiting outside that door. But logic had no place here. Not now. Not with the way his body pressed against mine, the way his lips ignited something in me I hadn't felt in years. Somewhere, deep down, I knew this was a threshold. A line crossed. Irreversible. But as his hand traced the curve of my hip, as his lips found mine again with an urgency that matched my own, I realized something with startling clarity. I didn't care. And somewhere deep inside, I knew there was no turning back. His hands moved slowly, tracing the curves of my body with deliberate precision, each touch igniting a fire beneath my skin through the thin fabric separating us. I felt his breath warm against my ear, a low, restrained exhale escaping his throat as I instinctively tightened my grip on his biceps, seeking an anchor amid the whirlwind of sensations consuming us. His hips pressed closer, heat radiating from his body, engulfing me in a way that made me forget we were still in the office, just a few glass doors away from the outside world. His fingers trailed down the length of my spine, pulling me in until I could feel the rapid thud of his heartbeat in sync with my own. I couldn't remember who moved first. All I knew was that clothing became an afterthought as his lips traveled down my neck, lower still, leaving a searing path of heat across my skin. The spacious room suddenly felt smaller, closing in around us until the only thing I could perceive was the warmth of his body, the undeniable hunger pulling us deeper into something neither of us could escape. Any thoughts of right or wrong had long since faded. All I knew was that I wouldn't stop. And with the way he touched me, the way he claimed me as if I were the only thing he craved, I knew he felt exactly the same. What started as a single kiss unraveled into something uncontrollable, an all-consuming force that neither of us could resist. It began with stolen moments in dimly lit hallways, our fingers brushing, eyes meeting for a fraction too long. The tension between us became unbearable, thick and charged, a weight pressing down on every interaction. Every accidental touch, every whispered exchange, became an unspoken promise of what was to come. The secrecy fueled the obsession. It was the way he would lean just a little too close when passing behind me at the office, the fleeting graze of his fingertips over my wrist. The way his gaze darkened with something primal and unspoken when no one was looking. The anticipation was intoxicating, more powerful than reason, more potent than guilt. I found myself waiting for those brief, stolen moments, for the thrill of something forbidden, for the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Our meetings grew bolder. Late-night phone calls where silence stretched between us, heavy with the things we didn't dare say. Secret rendezvous in his car, where the world outside faded into nothingness, leaving only the heat between us. There was something reckless, exhilarating, about knowing we were on the edge of catastrophe and stepping even closer. But beneath the exhilaration, the guilt festered. Jason was a good man, stable, reliable, loving. He had never given me a reason to doubt him, never been anything but constant in a life that had otherwise begun to feel stagnant. And yet, with every touch, every kiss, every whispered confession in the dark, I moved further away from the life I had built with him. I told myself I could stop, that I could walk away from this before it destroyed everything. But each time I tried, Sebastian pulled me back, and not with force, but with something even more dangerous, understanding. He saw the parts of me I had buried beneath years of routine. He saw the longing, the restlessness, the desire for something more, something unspoken. And I let myself believe, if only for a fleeting moment, that he could fill the void I had spent so long pretending didn't exist. The affair consumed me. It seeped into every part of my life, threading through my thoughts at work, invading my dreams at night. I caught myself checking my phone too often, looking for his name, craving his attention. My body tensed at the sound of his voice. My pulse quickened at the sight of him walking toward me. He became an addiction, one I wasn't sure I wanted to break. But with every moment of pleasure, guilt followed like a shadow. I saw it in Jason's face when he reached for me and I flinched. In the quiet way, he watched me as I stared too long at my phone, in the hesitation that had begun to color our conversations. He didn't know, not yet. But suspicion was growing, a slow and creeping presence that threatened to shatter the fragile illusion I had built around myself. And still, I continued. Because the affair was no longer just about Sebastian. It was about me. About the person I had become when I was with him. About the way I had shed the version of myself that had once been content with quiet dinners and predictable routines. About the way I had allowed myself to want again. But I knew how these stories ended. Affairs didn't stay hidden forever. Secrets had a way of unraveling, of coming to light in the moments you least expected. And yet, even knowing the inevitable, I couldn't stop. I was too far gone, caught in the storm, waiting for the moment it would all come crashing down around me. It wasn't a sudden explosion, nor a dramatic confrontation filled with shouting and accusations. Instead, it was a slow, creeping unraveling, small, almost imperceptible moments that accumulated like grains of sand in an hourglass, each one bringing me closer to the inevitable. Jason noticed first in the way I moved. The way I flinched ever so slightly when he reached for my hand, the subtle hesitation in my embrace, the distance that had seeped into our once effortless intimacy. He noticed how often my phone was face down on the table, how my responses to his texts were delayed, how I seemed distracted even when I was right in front of him. He noticed the changes in my scent, the occasional trace of cologne that wasn't his, the faint but unmistakable difference that lingered on my skin when I returned home late. I told myself he wouldn't suspect. That after years of trust, of predictability, he would never entertain the idea that his wife, his steady, reliable wife, could betray him in the ways I had. But trust doesn't shield the truth, it only delays the reckoning. It was a single text message that shattered everything. A moment of carelessness, of complacency, after so many months of meticulously covering my tracks. Thinking of you. 2 simple words from Sebastian, glowing on my phone screen like a beacon of guilt. I had been in the shower when Jason found it. By the time I stepped out, the air in the apartment had changed. It was thick, suffocating, laced with something I couldn't quite name but immediately understood. He was waiting in the kitchen, the phone resting on the counter beside him, his posture unnervingly still. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my body going cold even as steam from the bathroom clung to my skin. My mind raced, grasping for explanations, for lies, for anything that could undo what had already been set in motion. But there was nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, before he finally spoke, his voice eerily steady. Devoid of the anger I had expected, I had always assumed that if this moment ever came, it would be loud. That Jason would yell, demand answers, slam his fist against the table. Instead, he simply looked at me, searching, waiting. That was worse. Because in his silence, I saw the devastation, the slow, dawning realization of betrayal sinking into him like a wound he hadn't yet decided how to treat. I wanted to run, to turn away, to retreat into the safety of denial. But there was no safety now. No words that could erase what had already been laid bare. For the first time in my life, I had no escape. No justifications, no deflections. Just the unbearable weight of what I had done, pressing down on me like a collapsing building. And when he finally asked the question, the only question that mattered, I knew that lying wouldn't save me. I had already lost more than I could ever hope to regain. So I did the only thing left to do. I told him the truth. Jason left that night, and with him, everything I had spent years building seemed to shatter into fragments too sharp to hold. I sat on the couch, staring at the text that had unraveled my world, reading those damning words over and over until they blurred into meaninglessness. The weight of my choices pressed down on me like an anchor, suffocating in a way I had never anticipated. I had known guilt before, had lived with it like an unwelcome guest, but this was something else entirely. This was the beginning of a reckoning I wasn't prepared for. The silence in the apartment felt deafening, stretching into the early hours of the morning. I expected Jason to return, half believing he would walk through the door and tell me this was all some terrible mistake. But he didn't. His absence settled into the walls, into the air, into my bones, making itself at home in a space that had once belonged to both of us. At work, things were no better. I could feel the shift the moment I walked through the office doors. Conversations hushed when I entered the break room. Eyes darted away when I caught someone staring for too long. The whispers were constant, curling around me like vines, suffocating and inescapable. I knew who had started them. The coworker who had seen us in Sebastian's office hadn't stayed silent, and now I was the center of a story being told behind every closed door. I told myself I didn't care, that I could endure it, that as long as I kept my head down and focused on my work, it would pass. But shame had a way of seeping into every crack, of staining everything it touched. I felt it in the way people moved around me, as if afraid my mistakes were contagious. I felt it in the way my inbox grew emptier, in the way meetings I had once led were suddenly handled by someone else. I was still there, still breathing, but I had already become a ghost in my own life. Sebastian, ever composed, dismissed my concerns. People forget, he had said, his voice as smooth as ever, untouched by the weight of consequences. But he was wrong. People didn't forget. Not about things like this. And certainly not about people like me. But none of it mattered compared to the one person who truly couldn't forget, Jason. I reached for him in the following days. Sent messages I knew he was reading but refusing to acknowledge. The apartment felt cavernous without him, the spaces he had once filled now gaping voids. I barely slept, afraid that if I closed my eyes for too long, I would wake up in a world where he had disappeared completely. Then, one morning, I saw it. His side of the closet, half empty. His things, the ones that had always been a permanent fixture of our life together, gone. No note. No explanation. Just absence as final as a slammed door, as undeniable as the truth I had been trying to outrun. That was when I knew there was no coming back from this. I dragged myself to work, going through the motions, pretending I could still function in the life I had built. But everything was unraveling too quickly, and I was too exhausted to keep up. The meetings, the stolen glances, the whispers, the tension, it was all too much. Even Sebastian, with his quiet reassurances and his lingering touches, had begun to feel like another weight pressing down on me rather than the escape he had once been. In the end, I did the only thing I could. I resigned. Sebastian tried to stop me, his words laced with a conviction I no longer shared. Stay. Let this pass. But I knew better. I had already lost too much. Staying would only mean losing more. So, I walked away, leaving behind the wreckage of what once was, knowing that whatever came next, I would have to face it alone. Months passed before I heard from Jason again. The silence between us had stretched into something heavy, something suffocating. I had sent messages he never answered, left voicemails that were met with nothing but emptiness. Eventually, I stopped trying, resigning myself to the reality that some things, once broken, could never be pieced back together. And then, out of nowhere, a message appeared. A simple request. Let's talk. The moment I walked into the cafe, I knew things would never be the same. Jason was there, already seated, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had likely gone cold. His eyes met mine. But they weren't the eyes I had known for years. These held something different, something distant. A quiet wariness that told me he was here for closure, not reconciliation. We talked, or at least, I did. I told him I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to destroy everything we had built, that I didn't know what I was looking for when I walked into the fire. He listened. But his face betrayed nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, but heavy with something unshakable. I don't hate you, he said, and somehow, that hurt more than if he had screamed. I just don't know if I can ever see you the same way again. That was the moment I knew. Some wounds didn't heal. Some mistakes lived with you, etched into the spaces between who you were and who you had become. I had been chasing redemption, But what I had truly been seeking was absolution, and that was something Jason could never give me. I had to find it myself. We parted with no promises, no dramatic declarations. Just two people who had once loved each other, now standing on opposite sides of an irreparable divide. I walked away, feeling lighter and heavier all at once, knowing that moving forward meant carrying the weight of my choices, not erasing them. If there's anything I've learned, it's that temptation is fleeting, but consequences are permanent. Love is something worth fighting for, but sometimes the fight is knowing when to let go. What do you think? Would you have given a second chance? Or is some betrayal unforgivable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will keep you thinking long after they're over.